Welcome to this week's episode of the Rebel Justice podcast. Last week, Trystan spoke to Andrew Morris about imprisonment for public protection sentences. Feel free to have a listen if you haven't already. And now, for this week's podcast. I'm Iulia, and I'll be speaking to Ella and Harriet, two young women who trained as prison officers and have written a comedy about their experiences. Sellouts is making the rounds of many UK cities, including London, Edinburgh and Birmingham. So check them out on glasshousetheatre.co.uk for how you can get your tickets. Today, we'll be speaking about the role of humour and performance in processing trauma. Please note that some of the topics discussed may cause distress and that there are brief mentions of self-harm and suicide, so listen with care. So, can you tell us a little bit about your show?
Yeah, absolutely. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for having us. So our show is a true story of mine and Ella's time working as prison officers. So we spent just over 2 years working as prison officers in London prisons. And we've now written a play about that experience and wanted to explore some of the realities of the justice system, the things we saw, the experiences we had working in it. And yeah, I worked in a male prison and Ella worked in a female prison, so with women. So two quite different stories, but it kind of tracks our time spent there and brutalisation, the burnout, the hilarity. I think there's a lot of dark comedy in it. So yeah, hopefully it's funny, but it's our true story of our time there. And we perform it as well. So it's kind of written and performed by ex-frontline staff.
That sounds incredible. So you said that you worked in a men's prison, Harriet, and you worked in a women's prison. So how did you both meet? Was there much crossover between the prisons?
Yeah, so we actually applied together. We vaguely knew each other at university and had just finished humanities degrees. And Harriet sent me an email with this graduate scheme that said, a fully funded master's and the opportunity to work within prisons. And I think we were both very interested in frontline work anyway, and we're kind of considering other graduate schemes, potentially social work, things with a social justice lean. This opportunity came up. Harriet sent it to me. It was the first year it was running. We both went, yeah, all right. Let's do it, rather naively, and ended up literally finishing university doing 6 weeks of very speedy training. And by the September, were plonked into the prison landings. And, the rest is history, I suppose.
So what did it actually say on the job ad, on the master's ad? Like, how was it promoted to you?
So it was promoted as a frontline role. That you'd have a lot of chance to develop your own ideas and be a leader within the criminal justice system and be a force for rehabilitation. Whether that was the reality is another thing. Fortunately, the role of the officer leaves no time to do that. It barely left us time to do our masters, to be honest, because after 12 hours on the landing with people shouting at you and, nearly getting assaulted, you don't really want to come home and then read huge articles about prison reform. And so therefore, in terms of putting in place your own rehabilitation initiatives, you're so burnt out by that point. So that would potentially be more the reality of what happened.
Wow, that sounds really, really difficult and intense. What was the master's supposed to be in?
It was initially advertised as a rehabilitation master's. Rehabilitation theory and leadership in a custodial setting was the full title. It got changed to leadership and change management theory. Mm-hmm. So that was the master's that we studied. So we were studying concepts of leadership and management within a custodial setting. So a lot of it was about theories of authority and theories of power within prison and that environment. And, within our own master's thesis and dissertations, we were allowed a lot of flexibility. So I wrote about domestic violence programs and treatment for survivors and perpetrators and using arts in that context. And Ella, you wrote about use of theatre in prisons.
I wrote about the current initiatives for women survivors of domestic abuse within the prisons.
Yeah, so we kind of we found our specialisms through that study, but it was a very challenging process to be full-time prison officers and part-time master's students. And that was quite complicated, I think, when you're studying the environment that you're living through, when it's quite traumatizing in a really intense environment. So yeah, it was complicated in that regard, definitely.
Wow, that does sound like an incredibly difficult experience. And it must have been, as you say, so hard to analyze what you're currently living through. So what led you to specialize in the areas that you did? Did you have many experiences of working with the prisoners on creative projects?
I think both Ella and I, our background was very much in theatre, both growing up and at university. And I think maybe long term we knew that it was something we really wanted to use as a tool. I think within the prison service as it stands, it was almost non-existent. There's a couple of companies doing really incredible work that both Ella and I were lucky enough to do placements with and work alongside a little bit. And we saw like the impact that those organisations have had, like Clean Break, to name drop Clean Break, the incredible theatre company, and Unlock Drama, both going into prisons and specialising in working with people who've had lived experience. And they use theatre as an amazing tool to support people to kind of process and heal. So I think we both knew the impact it could have. And especially now, after writing the play, we've kind of experienced firsthand how healing it can be to process something traumatic, to kind of claim the story and to retell the story is really powerful. And I think actually for us, a big part of articulating what we saw, that act of putting it into a show and sharing that story and talking to a lot of other people who've worked in the prisons in different capacities, speaking to lots of other officers from diverse backgrounds and kind of hearing them tell their stories and being able to share that with audiences. We know, like now, especially firsthand, how important that can be. So I think that's always been there, that awareness. And I think one of the things you see the most working in prisons is how performative it is as an environment. We say this a lot, like how many roles people play. You know, people living within prison, people working within prison, adopt characters as a self-protection measure. You don't want to bring the vulnerable, like true part of your identity in there, because it's such a inhumane and abusive environment. And so people do perform these roles and characters. So when we have done work and theatre work after our time as officers, we've really noticed that it's already happening. People take to the performative side of it really naturally because it's familiar to them. Putting on a mask is familiar. Like, that's what people do every day just to get by. So it can be a space that lets them kind of take off that mask and maybe explore other roles and other identities. So yeah, I think we kind of really do believe in the power of theatre. I think for a long time as officers, we lost that. I won't lie. Working inside that environment, you also do think, I think these people maybe need jobs more than they need me to do a drama club with them. And that is still true. But I think we really are kind of passionate about that, the importance that creative space can give people to heal. So yeah, that probably was there from well, even when we were studying the masters, we were already kind of exploring that idea, and we're doing that a lot more now in our work.
Wow. I mean, that sounds really important, the work you were doing there. And of course, it must have been difficult confronting what may have felt like some very big issues in a kind of indirect way. How do you feel about having now left the justice system to work more broadly in the creative sector?
I think it's taken us a long time to reframe our roles, because when we initially left frontline work as prison officers, we felt a lot of guilt and a lot of shame for leaving, that we couldn't hack it. But the reality is, I don't think anyone should be made to hack that kind of job. It is the most brutal environment to work in. And it shouldn't be like a sign of weakness that you can't do it, because I don't think anyone can really do it. It's very funny because we became so institutionalised when we were officers that these civilian staff, these civvies would come in with their bright ideas and I'd be like, oh my God, can you please get off my landing? I've got a regime to run and I've got literally 60 women all needing different things, and not just like toilet roll or a doctor's appointment, like needing really severe intervention. And you're wanting me to unlock someone for a workshop. Amazing. And now I know that is just as important, right? You know, my logical, more calm brain. But when you're in that environment, it's just survival. You're literally just getting by. And that's what's so difficult with trying to implement any kind of initiative, is because you're coming up against so many barriers, and barriers that I now understand. Like, I understand when things get cancelled because there's been, lockdown. That's why. So I literally, like, hats off to people who have been doing this activism work for 20 odd years or 30 years, because you do get slightly disillusioned, because, as Harriet said, it's like, they don't need theatre. They need, proper therapy. They need their medication. They need jobs. And it's like, no, they're basic requirements. And everyone should also be given the opportunity to be able to be creative and have a safe environment and feel love and feel joy. And it's just as important. But because you are literally in fight or flight every day, you begin to forget that. And that's why these prison environments are so zapped and so drained of any sort of humanity or love or creativity. So I think we need to keep reminding ourselves that no matter how hard the work is, it's so necessary and it's so important, because they literally haven't, like, there is nothing at the moment like going on in prisons. Let's be completely honest. There's people working so hard to try and get stuff in, but the day to day, they get to go to the gym, and that's probably about it. And that's in the female estate. The male estate, they probably don't even get that when you're, I'll let Harriet speak about that. And when they did get the opportunity to do something creative, it was like, it would make me so emotional, because they were just seeing them be able to, like, have a bit of freedom to be, like, a human again, and to not just, like, be one in a system. It's just so important. And I think that's what keeps driving me and Harriet, no matter how tired we get. And don't get me wrong, when we were officers, we were very tired.
That's really inspiring to hear. What was your experience, Harriet, in terms of in the male prisons and creativity there day to day? Were there many opportunities for creativity? Did you get involved in leading any sessions?
In my capacity as an officer, no. I couldn't envisage an environment where I could be both, this absolutely wild figure of authority that role demands of you, the person who barges into cells and strip searches people and violates human rights in that way. And that is one of the demands of that role. The dual demand of that role is that you are also able to kind of support people through drug detoxes and be the person that is the first port of call for them if they lose a family member on the outside, if they experience a recall, if something happens, you're their only port of call. So you're already this dual role. And I think when I was in that headspace and trying to navigate that balance, the idea of then being vulnerable with the men that I worked with in the way that theatre demands of you, that kind of exposing of yourself, felt so far from possible, which breaks my heart, because I think actually it would be the most reformative kind of transformational experience if some of the officers on my landing that I worked with, including myself, could have exposed that kind of vulnerability to those men, and especially in a gendered context, because I think, like, I don't want to perpetuate ideas of gender roles, and I really disagree with them, and I don't agree with gender as a concept, but that environment really believes in gender as a concept and hammers home those gender roles to such a degree that it is hyper masculine. So the idea of anyone exposing any kind of vulnerability, performing any role besides toxic male, is quite unimaginable. Having said that, whilst I was an officer, I went to a different establishment where I didn't work as an officer and I was a new face, and I went in the capacity of a theatre facilitator, and I made work with men in prison there. They didn't know I was an officer, and that was quite important, I think, because the dynamic that is created by that uniform is so negative and it's so divisive, and I think that's intentional in the structure of prison. I think that's one of the reasons that I don't fundamentally agree with it, or that role, is it meant that I kept it kind of quiet. I didn't talk about that with them, but we did have some amazing experiences doing that, and some of the men played prison officers in a piece of theatre that they devised in a week, and that was quite revelatory for me to see them do that. I think that was pretty kind of mind-blowing. So I wish I had in my own prison been able to do that, and if that space existed, I think that would be a reimagining of a prison space completely, which I would be very pro. But I can't quite picture that happening in this current environment that we have created in our prisons in the UK.
Yeah, it sounds like you've had to embody a massive range of personas and roles while still feeling quite confined in terms of, as you said, gender roles and power dynamics. So it's really interesting to hear about the ways in which you can kind of reclaim theatre and performance in a kind of empowering way. And I think that's so important that you've been able to unlock that in yourselves and you're working towards that in others. I think we'll come back to your point about the sort of gendered environment and the hypermasculinity. But I wanted to first ask you about how you felt the process of institutionalization happened.
I think what's quite funny and what the play is based on and shows is this fall from me and Harriet being like, yeah, we can bring in ideas, we can change the system, to becoming so burnt out and brutalised that I honestly didn't even recognise us by the end. Prison is so dangerous because it honestly eradicates everyone's individuality. And on prisoners, it happens on such an extreme violent scale, but also for the staff. I thought I would never become one of these people that laughed along with jokes that I didn't agree with. I never thought I'd be one of these people that was like, if we're being brutally honest, you know, someone would self-harm for the sixth time that day, and that is the most horrific thing. They're in serious pain and serious need, and I'd be there like, oh really, like again, oh have we got to deal with it? And that's of course not me, that's no one. You know, if you see someone in severe pain, you're going to want to help and you're going to want to be there. But I was like, God, when am I clocking off? Like when do I get to go home? And when it got in the way of you going home, you were annoyed. That's how institutionalized you become, because you are also being treated like absolute crap. There's no support. You're so burnt out. You're so traumatized because of the repeat trauma that you're seeing day in, day out, like the huge scales of self-harm and suicide that you come into contact with. Yeah, you completely lose a sense of self and you literally just have to concentrate on when you can go home. I think that was what was so scary. You think you're never going to become what you sort of like hated at the beginning, or what you saw as like, oh God, I'd never be an officer who did this. It was so naive, because you can't not. For survival's sake, you can't not. You have to assimilate with staff. You have to get along with people because they're the ones that are protecting you. And if you don't, they won't run when there's alarm being sounded and you're the one being beaten up. So of course you laugh along with jokes, you don't. And so it's wild. You completely sacrifice every inch of your integrity, mold yourself into this role that you fundamentally disagree with, whilst trying to help people desperately. And it failed. It really, yeah, we didn't help ourselves.
I mean, it's incredible that you were able to recognize that process, because
insight.
Yeah.
a lot of therapy.
A lot of therapy and a lot of
therapy talking there.
I don't think we realised it during. And what the play unpicks is our different trauma responses and how quite hilariously gendered they were, considering the estates we were working in and the difference in our sacrificing of our humanity and becoming, quite frankly, quite horrid people. No, we've done a lot of healing, but the fact that we needed from 2 years of working in it, like, can you imagine how much healing somebody who's serving, 7 years / a life sentence is going to need for living in there? Unimaginable.
Absolutely. What's the longest period of time that a prison officer would normally work for? Because I'm assuming burnout is quite common.
Oh, burnout's very common. It's very common, I think. But I mean, people join the job when they're 18 and stay in it till retirement. I mean, that's not like unheard of. And I think when we talk about institutionalization, there are some terrifying statistics about prison officers. The danger scales of the job are also linked with like post the job, like leaving, because the effect and the impact of institutionalization does mean that you really struggle to function outside of that role. Like it's very difficult to reintegrate with society. And I think a lot of staff upon retirement, a lot of it catches up to them, and actually like it's talked about amongst staff. I remember those conversations about what happened to so-and-so after they left, and like drinking spiraling out of control and like tragic losses of life, and suicide rates amongst staff is really high, and it's scary. And I think there is so much unprocessed around that, and that's the thing that, like what Ella was speaking to there about what we thought of ourselves and who we thought we would be in that environment is absolutely true of I would vote for 99% of the staff that I met, maybe 99.9. I mean, we love in the media to talk about these evil officers who come in and all the corruption levels. And I think actually, like, for me, the staff force is made up of exactly what we became, people who've started out with these incredible, compassionate reasons and this care and a lot of the time first-hand experience themselves of the communities that end up in prison. And that level of compassion is eroded. And I think I definitely went in thinking I would be very separate from these officers. And now I completely understand how you become what you become in that environment. We talk about the inhumanity of that space. Like, it is so inhuman for the people incarcerated, and that leaches out. And I think for officers to be able to do what's demanded of them, they view prisoners as inhuman. And for the system to do what it wants to the staff, it views the staff as inhuman. Like, everyone is treated as a cog in that machine. So I think that institutionalization, that length of service that some people go through, 25 years of working there, we both knew lots of people who had worked there for that amount of time, and there are just parts of themselves that they have shut off, and some of them can talk about that. You know, I had some really insightful conversations with those members of staff, and a lot of it went into our show. We had some fantastic interviewees whose verbatim interviews we use in the show, so you hear their actual voices played, and you know, they shared with us some stuff that was really insightful and so reflective. And, you know, they've been in that system for a really long time and they can see it, but they can't always leave it. I think that's something a lot of officers talk about, is how you break up with being an officer and what the world looks like if you haven't got that role. And it's really complicated. It's really difficult. We went through the process on a micro level, both of us. I think I still have moments where I miss that world, and I miss the people in it that I met, and I miss the men, and I miss the other staff. And so much of my rational brain says that makes no sense. You know, you had the worst time. But you do. You can't let go of something that's shaped you quite as much as it has. It's really difficult to let go of that.
That's a really interesting point. It's not something I've ever really considered, especially given all of the trauma that you both talk about. But I guess that completely makes sense. It's a toxic relationship in a way, isn't it? If you don't mind me making that assumption.
No, that's exactly it. You're trauma bonded.
Yeah. Can you tell me a bit more about what you maybe enjoy is too strong a word, but what you found resonated with you, or what you missed about life as a prison officer?
Yeah, I think it might be very different for me and Harriet, but given that the environments are so vastly different that they are not even really comparable, I think what is maybe like most shocking and what I did not realise going in is, you get taught during officers training to have these boundaries constantly, about these boundaries and these barriers you have to have between yourself and prisoners. Honestly, in the female estate, it's near on impossible. It's the most intimate environment. Like, physically, the female estate is smaller. Emotionally, everything is so intimate, because you see these women, you know, that you're the ones giving them their tampons. You know when they're all on their period. You know when they're having a bad day. You know when their kids getting taken. They're the ones that are then coming and crying on your shoulder. They also know when you're having a shit day. They're able to see. They're able to be like, "Oh, miss, what's going on?" Like, so it's incredibly hard when you know the ins and outs of these women. You spend every day with them, more time you spend with them than your own family and your own friends. To then have the sort of cognitive dissonance, which is basically what you have to then be a figure of authority, and I think we both go as far as saying as an abuse, because you are having to treat them as less than human. And it's really, really weird and screwed up when you become a figure of authority, but you're also the one locking them in a tiny, tiny cage every night. And that relationship is so warped. You have to be both this figure of love and care. And in the female estate, you do. There's no, like, you can't not. You can't be shut off. Like, you do really have to provide emotional support. And I think I did not realise the scale and the toll that would take on me and the workforce, because you're having to support these women through the most horrific things. And they're they're literally the most strong and incredible women that I've ever met. And I think that's, as much as that was the part that took its biggest toll on me and probably led to my own, demise for not wanting to be dramatic. It was also the part I think I love most. And you have a laugh because you know each other through and through. Like, you have a laugh with the women, you're able to share stories. They talk so much to you about their lives, and you can have a natter. You can sit and have a little coffee in the cells with them and chat about their lives, because there's nothing else going on. Like, that's really the reality, is a lot of the job, and I think people don't realise, is talking. And the difficulty is you're sharing stories constantly, but it's not really sharing. You're just doing the listening, because you can't share any personal information. So it's this sort of one-way bonding where they then rely on you for, 24/7 emotional care. But I think that the bit I enjoyed most was, meeting, some of the most resilient women I've ever met, and some of the most resilient staff. And you have to have a sense of humour. And I think this is why me and Harriet have written a comedy, because you have, it's one of those things you will literally just cry if you don't laugh. So it's having a bit of a laugh a lot of the time.
Yeah, humour is definitely something I'm gonna ask you more about later, because I think it's such a brilliant angle. And
it's a big old strong coping mechanism.
What about you, Harriet? How did you find?
Yeah, it is different. That's so funny. I was listening to your answer and I was like, when is she going to get to the bit that she enjoyed? Because this is all sounding terrible. But no, we do always have to preface it with that kind of thing, don't we? The complications of it. But it's very different in the male estate. It's also very similar in the level of the domesticness, everyday, mundane domestic life of that environment. You do literally live together. So if you were being raging and strict and authoritarian all the time, you'd have a heart attack within 6 months. Your body couldn't take that. So there was a lot of hilarity. I mean, the amount of stories that we have from that time, it is bonkers. And you do build relationships. There was somebody on my landing who, they were there for nearly all the 2 years that I was there, so I knew them well. And like Ella said, they will pick up on you as much as you'll pick up on them in terms of mood. And he could see I was having a really stressful day. And he used to work in the farms and gardens of the prison. So he would go off to these amazing polytunnels where they would grow loads of the food that we would then be using in the prison. And he just brought back this huge aubergine that looked like it had a bum. It looked like it had a bum crack. And he brought it back to show me, because he was like, I saw your face this morning and I felt like you needed to see this aubergine. I was like, you're absolutely right. I did need to see this aubergine. I'm so glad you brought this aubergine back to the landing. It went in the office in the window. Everyone would see the aubergine every day, and it's things like that I don't think I would ever have pictured, my life including, when we started this. I don't think that's something that anyone who hasn't been in that environment can understand. I think anybody who has been in that environment would hear that story and have 25,000 other versions of it to share. Everybody I know who's come into contact has those little moments, and they really stick out to you because it's so grey and it's so bleak. But there is something about humans that you learn in that world that they will find a way to find little glimpses of, joy might be too strong, but aubergines that look like bums, at the bare minimum. We're going to find a couple of those, and it's going to be the thing that gets you through the week. That's really important. And like Ella said, it's at the end of the day, the people are who we make this show for. They're why we do it. They're why we create the work. The people that we met in there, they were kind of, fully life-changing. And I think the humour and the camaraderie people talk about, it has two sides of that coin. There's a lot of toxicity around it, and I don't deny that at all. But there is also a lot of fundamental survival through hope and trying to find humour And I think that's pretty fundamental, and that's a big part of the show, definitely, is the bits that, we perform it sometimes to a mixture of officers and staff and people with no understanding of the prison, and the laughs are in very different places. You can hear who is from what background based on what they will laugh at, which is quite joyful for us, I think, to maybe bridge that gap a little bit and kind of get that dialogue going.
I mean, thank you so much for sharing that story about the aubergine. That in itself, that is the best sales pitch you could have possibly given for your show.
That's not even in the show. That didn't even make it in the show, that story. So there's an hour and 20 minutes more of those. We had to cut that one.
Wow. Better than an aubergine. How does that happen? Well, I guess it makes sense to talk about humour then. What role do you think humour has for you in this healing journey and just in terms of approaching issues around injustice in the justice system and activism and getting people to engage with the issues that you talk about in the play?
Yeah, I mean, humour was our biggest coping mechanism. It is for prisoners, it is for prison officers. I honestly do think that most prison officers should have their own stand-up show, because they are genuinely, they've got the gift of the gab. And you have to have the gift of the gab, because that's how you de-escalate situations. You've got to be able to make people laugh and just have a bit of humour and a bit of humanness to you. So when me and Harriet started doing this, writing this show and talking about how we use theatre, it all did start off honestly, just us exchanging the most insane, ridiculously funny stories, to the point where we'd be weeping, nearly wetting ourselves. And I think, honestly, yeah, the prison service is just the mostly ridiculous, comedic place. And I think what is so insane is the two sides of the coin. The fact that it's the most harrowing, dark, terrifying, dehumanizing environment ever, but then also the most ridiculously clownish at the same time. And you flip between having a laugh with someone, having a joke with someone, and then literally within 5 minutes you're going and wrapping someone up and nearly getting punched in the face. So how does your brain flip between those two? I think it was massively a coping mechanism for us. So we utilised that. And I think we've had a lot of humorous tears throughout this process, but it's also allowed us to actually do the real work and have some real tears, because ultimately we were both very, very, very repressed. And we had to laugh at ourselves. So I think what took a long time was us to be able to feel empathy for ourselves and to be oh no, this was a bad thing that you went through, and it is a horrific environment, and you don't always have to laugh at things. And that was what took longer. I think the comedy of it and the laughs kind of came more naturally.
Definitely. And I think also there's something in the structure of the show that we wanted to create, that I think comedy and humour can be a really powerful equaliser. I think it can invite people in to something that they maybe wouldn't understand or be able to feel like they could access otherwise. We start the show very much laughing at ourselves, laughing at we're the butt of the joke. And that's always going to be that, we're never going to make other people the butt of a joke when we're writing a show. But it's really important that audiences are invited in through that comedy, and it feels accessible to everybody to kind of partake in that. And I think when you think about prison and you talk about prison, people aren't feeling like it's something that they're going to laugh about. And I think it's important that that's examined. I think it's important to examine that and why we rely on humour in that way and what that does to us as people, but also how it can, when you talk about our activist work and activism and engaging people, actually looking at the ridiculousness of a prison service, that the absolutely laughable idea that it's in any way a solution is also important. There is something for me that is absolutely outrageous about that concept. And I think it's at a point where, you need to find ways in to the conversation, and we start by making letting people laugh at us, and then as the show goes on you see what we start laughing at in our journey to brutalisation, and audiences are kind of pulled up short and oh, I actually don't want to laugh with you at this anymore, but I've kind of been complicit for a while. And that was the feeling I think we had moving through the system, was going in and eventually becoming very complicit with stuff, and laughing along, and what that actually means in terms of your integrity as an individual, and you know, how you're actually standing up and trying to change something. So it's a complicated tool, comedy, in that regard. I think we're like very much feeling our way through it and working it out. But yeah, I think to not have it in the show would be to massively misrepresent the fuel of the prison service. So it was really like, it was going to be fundamental always, I think.
Yeah, I think it's also very interesting in terms of how quickly everything is normalised in humour, and we wanted to bring the audience along on that journey, and for them to catch themselves laughing and then question as to why they're laughing at that, but they should not be laughing at that. And I think even with our director, we tell stories at the beginning and she'd be like, that's not funny. Like, wow, that's really disturbing. And then by the end of the rehearsal process, my God, she was cackling away, because how quickly you become normalised through humour. So it's been a bit of a social experiment, to be honest, how humours function.
Wow, I mean, it sounds like you deal with it in a very thought-provoking way, and I can't wait to see it myself next week. I wanted to just ask you a bit about how your experiences have driven and inspired your activism and what you're doing now.
Yeah. So I think we realised, potentially whilst working as officers, actually, that we both felt quite strongly about defunding and abolition within the prison sector, which is quite complicated when you're working in it and you don't agree with your own job existing. And I think we're both very conscious that it can be quite a divisive topic and people can find it quite difficult to access. And it's taken us a long time to fully process where we stand and the idea of defunding and moving away from that system. But the kind of networks of reformers and the people that we are now like working alongside and really inspired by, I think a lot of the strategy and the movements in this area are going towards that aim. I think there's a sense that a lot of other approaches are kind of a band-aid over a bullet wound sort of thing. So our focus is on how frontline voices and people with lived experience, how central that needs to be to all of the discussions about abolition, about criminal justice reform in all its different guises. And we're really passionate and interested in starting those dialogues that can maybe potentially be divisive normally. I think our background and intersection of being from both a theatre, social justice warrior, activist standpoint, and having been a part of the institution, a part of the problem, arguably, worked in that frontline capacity, that's where we want to sit in between and bring together those groups. So as Glasshouse Theatre, we now run workshops. We run workshops with kind of lots of different groups. So we're doing some in schools with young people, exploring ideas around what they think prison is, its realities, its basis, its problems. We're also doing it with prison officers in prisons. So we're going back in and talking to staff about burnout and about brutalisation, what that means, what that looks like, opening up dialogues that we didn't see present when we were working there from our perspective as having been in that role. We're also looking to do it with families of people in prison, to start building, using our theatre background and our theatre sort of foundation to create a space for healing for people who've come into contact with that system. Because we're very conscious that the idea of just abolition is kind of scary, and actually there are so many people who've been wounded by that institution who deserve spaces to heal and be heard, and so we want to be a part of that if we can. So the play is kind of a thread in amongst this that we're using to create dialogue. You know, in some of our shows we're doing in Scotland later this year, we're going to be having like post-show Q&As to kind of build that space where people can ask questions. So yeah, we're wanting to work towards healthier, more compassionate conversations and using our experiences to do that, and hopefully platforming and championing other people's experiences too. Like, we would love to work with as many other people who have had different experiences to us, different lived experiences to us, to be championed and represented and involved in the organisation as well. So that's where we're sort of heading now.
It has taken us a while, and I think it's very easy to get overwhelmed on a macro level with the prison estate, especially when we're like, you know, living within a society where the Tory government are like, we're going to build 20,000 new prison places within the next 5 to 10 years. And it's like, there's what, £4 billion, I think, of funding going into building new prison places. And so it seems that the issue is only getting worse. On a macro level, it's very, very easy to get overwhelmed and to see abolition as this thing that is never going to happen. So I think what me and Harriet sometimes do is we take a step back and we work on a micro level and to try and initiate those compassionate and emotionally informed conversations and discussions, because that's where it starts. That's also how you change a macro level, is engaging policymakers who have probably never stepped foot in a prison, who for a fact we've met quite a few have never stepped foot in a prison, to just be like, spend time in them, to understand them. Because people who are, I honestly would go as far as saying like people who are pro-prison state and pro-punishment have never spent a prolonged period of time within a prison or with anyone with lived experience. So I think it's just what our activism is really angling towards, is just starting those discussions and bringing together like demographics, bringing them within prisons, asking them to unpick these discussions, having workshops, having safe spaces where policymakers can discuss with officers about the realities or with prisoners. I think that's where it begins, because the problem is only growing.
And the narrative is very black and white. That's the thing I think we've seen. We are comfortable now inhabiting grey areas. I think that's where people need to get a lot comfier, is being in the nuance and the grey area, and that it's not like a really straightforward black and white answer. There's not like a single solution. There's not like a single problem. It's not a black and white situation, but I think the dialogue around it currently in the media, societally, amongst in the pub with family and friends, people have really strong black and white opinions about something that arguably, because of how it's set up, is one of the most secretive public sectors, and it's people have opinions based on absolutely nothing. And I think finding nuance and grey area and being comfortable in that is where I think we really want to focus a lot of our time and try and get people kind of more comfortable and easy in that space.
Thank you both so much for talking to us about your experiences. I really appreciate you sharing your experiences and talking to us about the grey areas, the nuance, the humour, and your show. So if we want to come and watch Sellouts, how do we do that?
Well, we have got a one-night-only London show, which is coming out on Friday the 28th of October, so very soon. And it is at the Pleasance Main House in Islington in London at 8 p.m. You can get tickets on the Pleasance Theatre's website. You can also see upcoming dates around the UK. So we are coming to Edinburgh, to the Traverse Theatre at the end of November. We'll be there for 3 nights. And we've got an upcoming date in Oxford in the new year. We're hoping to add more theatres to the tour as well. So we will be looking at coming to a couple of other cities around the UK. If you're listening to this and you think we'd love to get sellouts in our city and our venue, then get in touch. But you can find out all other upcoming tour dates on our social media or on our website, which is Glasshouse Theatre.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been an absolute joy.
And that's all we've got time for today. If you'd like to support Sellouts, head to glasshousetheatre.co.uk. You can also follow Harriet and Ella on Twitter at GlassHouseTH and on Instagram at GlassHouseTheatre. If you've been affected by any of the issues discussed and would like to seek help, there are many organisations which offer support, including counselling-directory.co.uk. Thank you so much for listening and for supporting the Rebel Justice podcast. Follow us on Spotify and keep an eye out for our next episodes, which will be coming out soon.